They left her at the station like she was never meant to arrive, a bride without a groom, a name scratched out from the ledger like it had been a mistake from the start, and the wind carried dust across the wooden platform as if trying to erase her too. Her dress, once white, now dragged through dirt and ash, her hands still, her eyes steady, not begging, not breaking, just waiting in a silence that made people uncomfortable, and so they laughed instead. Men leaning against posts, boots scraping. The planks, voices low and sharp, calling her things that sounded easier than understanding her, calling her nothing, because nothing was safer, nothing didn't require kindness, and the station master shut his window with a quiet final click like closing a coffin lid on whatever chance she had left, and no one stepped forward, not a single soul in a town that measured worth in acres and cattle and the weight of man's name, until the sound of slow hooves cut through the morning, steady, unhurried, like time itself had decided to take notice. And Ethan Caldwell rode in without looking at the crowd, without asking questions, his coat clean, his hat low, his presence enough to quiet a room even when he said nothing. And he saw her the way no one else had, not as a problem, not as a spectacle, but as a person standing where no one chose to stand. And for a long second, the whole world seemed to narrow to the space between them. Dust hanging in the air, sunlight catching on the edge of her sleeve, and then he dismounted, boots hitting the ground with a sound that carried weight, not force. And he didn't speak to the men who watched, didn't answer the smirks or the whispers. He only stepped closer and asked a question so simple it sounded out of place. "You eaten?" And she shook her head once, just once. And he reached for his canteen, offering it without ceremony, without hesitation, like it was the most natural thing in the world. And when she lifted her hand to take it, the fabric slipped just enough for silver to catch the light, a small bracelet, worn but deliberate, and Ethan's eyes paused there, just a flicker, just a breath longer than necessary, before he looked away again like he'd seen something he wasn't ready to name. And somewhere behind him, a man laughed louder than before, calling it a fool's charity, calling it a waste. But Ethan didn't turn, didn't answer. He only stood there as she drank, slow, careful, like someone who understood the weight of what was being given. And in that moment, nothing else moved, not the wind, not the crowd, not even the dust, as if the whole town was holding its breath without knowing why. He did not ask her name, and she did not offer it. And somehow that silence felt more honest than anything the town had said all morning, as Ethan Caldwell turned back to his horse and simply nodded once, a quiet signal that required no explanation, and she followed without hesitation, her steps light but certain against the wooden platform, leaving behind the place that had already decided who she was without ever knowing her. And behind them the murmurs grew sharper, men shifting their weight, women watching from shaded windows, all of them measuring the moment in ways they could understand, counting risk, counting reputation, counting what a man like Ethan Caldwell might lose by bringing something unknown into his world. But Ethan did not slow, and he did not look back, his hand resting near the reins, steady, controlled, as if this was no different from any other morning ride, yet the air around them had changed, like a storm that had not yet shown its clouds. And when they reached the edge of town, where the packed dirt road opened into wide land that stretched for miles without fences strong enough to claim it, he finally spoke again, his voice low and even, asking only what mattered. "You got somewhere to go?" And she shook her head once more, the same quiet answer. No drama, no plea, just truth. And he studied her for a moment longer, not searching for weakness, but for something harder to define, something that could not be faked. And whatever he saw, there was enough. Because he turned his horse slightly and said, "Then you ride with me," like it was the simplest decision in the world. And she climbed up behind him without needing help, her movement practiced, balanced, like someone who understood horses and distance and the weight of choosing to move forward. And as they rode out, the town behind them did not return to normal. Not quite, because a few eyes lingered too long, a few voices dropped too quiet. And one old man near the general store narrowed his gaze at the memory of silver catching sunlight, his fingers tightening around a worn piece of cloth as if trying to hold onto a thought that refused to stay hidden. while miles away the land rolled in slow waves of dry grass and scattered trees. The kind of land that kept secrets well, and the only sounds were the rhythm of hooves and the wind moving low across the earth. And still Ethan did not ask her story, and still she did not explain, and that silence stretched between them not as distance, but as something shared, something chosen, until at last her hand shifted slightly against his coat, just enough for the bracelet to catch the light again. And this time he did not look away immediately, because there was something about the markings etched into that silver, something deliberate, something that did not belong to chance or trade. And though he said nothing, the way his shoulders settled told a different story, one the land itself seemed to recognize, because far off along the ridge, where heat blurred the horizon, shapes moved for just a second too long to be shadows, and then were gone again, leaving behind only the feeling that they had been seen first. The ranch sat quiet against the late afternoon sun, wood worn smooth by years of wind and waiting, the kind of place that did not ask questions because it had already learned how little answers mattered. And as Ethan guided the horse through the open gate, nothing rushed to greet them. No workers, no voices, just the slow creak of the fence swinging back into place like it had done 1,000 times before. And she slid down from the saddle without a word, boots touching the dirt as if she had stepped on a ground she already understood. And for a moment they stood there in the wide silence, the house ahead, the horizon behind, and something unspoken settling between them. Not tension, not comfort, but recognition of a choice that could not be taken back. And Ethan walked toward the porch, pushing the door open with the same steady motion he used for everything. And inside the air was cooler, carrying the faint scent of leather and old wood. A table set with nothing on it, a place built for one that had never expected more. And he reached for a tin cup, filled it, and set it down within her reach without looking directly at her, as if offering without forcing. And she stepped inside slowly, her eyes moving across the room, not with curiosity, but with awareness, like someone measuring space for meaning instead of comfort. And when she finally touched the cup, her fingers brushed the rim before lifting it, careful, deliberate. And Ethan noticed the way she held it, not like someone in used a kindness, but like someone who understood its cost. And outside the wind shifted, carrying a low sound across the land. Not loud enough to name, just enough to be felt. And Ethan's gaze drifted toward the window for a second too long before returning, because something in the distance had changed, something that did not belong to ordinary days. And still he said nothing, because silence had always served him better than words. And as the sun lowered, casting long shadows that stretched across the floor like lines drawn without permission, she moved toward the doorway again, not leaving, just standing where she could see both the house and the land beyond. And when the light caught her wrist, the silver bracelet shone once more, clearer now, the markings sharper in the fading glow. And Ethan finally spoke. Not a question, not yet, just a quiet statement that carried weight without demand. That is not something a man gives away. And she looked at him then, really looked, her eyes steady, unreadable. And for the first time there was something beneath the silence, not fear, not hesitation, but decision. And she answered in a voice as calm as the land itself. No, it is not. And that was all. No explanation, no story, just a truth placed between them like a stone that could not be moved. And outside, far beyond the fence line, the shapes that had watched from the ridge were no longer hiding. Not fully, just enough to be seen if someone knew where to look. And the air grew heavier, not with threat, but with purpose, the kind that arrives long before anyone understands it. And as the last light slipped behind the hills, Ethan removed his hat and set it down by the door, not out of habit, but out of respect for something he had not yet named, because deep down, in a place he did not often listen to, he already knew that whatever had followed her here had not come by accident, and whatever was coming next would not ask for permission. The night settled slowly, stretching across the land like a blanket pulled with careful hands, and the ranch held its breath in that quiet way places do when something unseen has already arrived. And inside the house the lantern burned low, casting soft light that did not quite reach the corners, leaving shadows to sit undisturbed. And Ethan remained near the window, not watching, not searching, just present. His stillness carrying more awareness than movement ever could, while she stood by the doorway, neither inside nor outside, balanced between two worlds as if she belonged fully to neither, and the wind moved again, brushing against the walls, slipping through the gaps in the wood with a whisper that sounded almost like distant voices, and somewhere beyond the fence a horse shifted its weight, just once, then went still, and Ethan's eyes lifted slightly, not in alarm, not in fear, but in recognition of a pattern he had learned long ago, the kind that told him the land was no longer empty, and he reached for the lantern, turning the flame lower instead of higher, dimming the light until the room felt smaller, quieter, more hidden, and still he said nothing, because words would not change what was already in motion, and she noticed the gesture, the way he chose shadow over brightness, and something in her expression softened, not relief, not gratitude, but acknowledgement, and she stepped further inside, finally crossing that invisible line, her presence shifting the space in a way that could not be measured. And when she moved, the bracelet caught the lantern's faint glow again, the silver now darker, the markings deeper, almost alive in the low light. And for the first time she spoke without being asked, her voice calm, steady. "They are close." And Ethan did not turn, did not question, only nodded once, as if confirming something he had already known, and outside the air changed again, heavier now. The kind of stillness that comes before a storm that does not break, with thunder, and along the ridge the shapes became clearer, no longer tricks of heat or distance, but riders, many of them, moving with purpose yet without haste. Their presence carried more by silence than by sound, and the cattle did not stir. The wind did not rise. Everything seemed to accept their arrival as something that had been decided long before this night, and Ethan rested his hand lightly on the back of a chair, grounding himself not in defense, but in readiness, the kind that does not come from fear. And she watched him then, studying the way he stood, the way he chose stillness instead of reaction. And in that moment something shifted again, deeper than before, because whatever test had begun when she stepped onto that train platform had not ended there. It had only followed him home, and now it stood just beyond his door, waiting not to take, not to threaten, but to reveal. And as the lantern flickered once in the quiet room, she lowered her gaze briefly, then lifted it again with quiet certainty, as if preparing not for what might happen, but for what must be seen. The first rider stopped at the edge of the fence just as the last light gave way to night, not crossing, not calling out, simply waiting in a stillness that carried more weight than any demand ever could, and behind him the others formed a line that stretched along the ridge like shadows given shape, their horses calm, their presence measured, as if every movement had already been decided long before they arrived, and Ethan stepped out onto the porch, the wood beneath his boots creaking softly. In the quiet, his hat still resting inside, his hands empty, visible, the way a man stands when he has nothing to prove and nothing to hide. And for a moment no one spoke, not the riders, not the wind, not even the land, as if the world itself had paused to see what would happen next. And then the lead rider moved forward just enough for the lantern light to touch his face, revealing lines carved by years and something deeper than age, something that spoke of authority without needing to be named. And his eyes did not search the house, did not measure the land. They went straight to Ethan, steady, unwavering. And when he finally spoke, his voice was low, calm, carrying across the distance without effort. "You brought her here." Not a question, not an accusation, just a truth placed in the open air, and Ethan nodded once. Nothing more, because anything else would have been unnecessary, and behind him, just inside the doorway, she stood without stepping forward, without hiding, her presence quiet but undeniable, like the center of something that had not yet revealed its shape. And the rider's gaze shifted then, not with surprise, not with doubt, but with recognition. And in that single glance something passed between them that the night itself seemed to understand, and the other riders remained still, not reaching for anything, not pressing closer, simply holding their place, as if this moment belonged to more than just the men standing in it. And Ethan spoke then, his voice matching the same calm weight. She had nowhere to go, and the words settled into the space between them, simple, unadorned, yet carrying more meaning than explanation ever could. And the rider studied him for a long second, not judging, not testing in any obvious way, but measuring something deeper, something that could not be seen in daylight or bought with land or gold. And the silence stretched again, not empty, but full, like a held breath that refused to break too soon. And then, slowly, the rider inclined his head, just a fraction, just enough to be noticed. And behind him, the line of men shifted, not forward, not back, but into a formation that felt less like arrival and more like acknowledgement. And inside the doorway, she stepped forward at last, her movement unhurried, her gaze steady. And when the lantern light caught the silver at her wrist, the markings seemed to deepen, to settle into something undeniable, and the rider's posture changed in a way so subtle it might have been missed, his shoulders lowering, not in weakness, but in respect. And still no one raised their voice, no one rushed the moment, because out here in the quiet between land and sky, the truth did not need to be spoken loudly to be understood. And Ethan stood there, not between them, not above them, simply present, as if whatever came next would not be decided by force, but by something far older, something that did not belong to any one man alone. The silence did not break. It deepened, settling over the land like something ancient that had been waiting for this exact moment. And the rider closest to the fence shifted his weight, not forward, not back, but downward, his boot touching the ground with deliberate care as he stepped off his horse. And one by one, without command, without signal, the others followed, their movements slow and measured, like men who understood that what they were doing carried more meaning than motion. And Ethan watched without reaching for anything, without changing his stance, because something in him recognized that this was not a confrontation, not a threat, but something far rarer, something that did not happen often in a man's lifetime. And beside him, she remained still, her presence no longer caught between worlds, but standing firmly within both, as if she had always known this moment would come. And the lead rider took a single step forward, stopping just short of the porch, the lantern light, catching the lines of his face again. And then, with no warning, no announcement, he lowered himself to one knee, the movement quiet but final, and behind him the others did the same. A line of men bowing not in submission, but in respect so complete it did not need explanation, and the land seemed to exhale with them, the wind easing, the night settling into something steady and calm. And Ethan did not move at first, because he understood the weight of what he was seeing, understood that this was not for show, not for him alone. And when he finally spoke, his voice was softer than before, not uncertain, but aware. "You do not kneel for me." And the rider lifted his gaze, meeting Ethan's eyes without hesitation. And for the first time, there was something close to warmth there, something that carried both history and decision. "No," he said simply. And then his eyes shifted past Ethan, to where she stood in the doorway. And in that glance, the truth began to take shape, not spoken yet, but undeniable. And she stepped forward then, just one step, enough for the light to fully reach her, enough for the silver bracelet to shine clearly against her wrist. And the rider bowed his head slightly, not lowering his eyes, but honoring something deeper than position. And when he spoke again, his voice carried across the quiet land like a truth that had waited long enough. "She chose to stand with you." And the words settled into Ethan's chest heavier than anything said before, because they were not about ownership, not about claim. They were about choice, and Ethan felt the shift then, not in the men before him, but in himself, the understanding that whatever this was, it had never been about taking her in. It had been about being seen by her, measured in a way no one in that town had ever done. And behind the kneeling line, the horses remained calm, the night unbroken, everything holding steady as if the world itself was respecting the moment. And Ethan reached up slowly, removing his hat not out of habit, but because it felt like the only honest response left. And he held it at his side, standing not above them, not apart from them, but within something that had just revealed its true shape. And in the quiet that followed, No one rushed to fill the space, because some truths do not need more words, they only need to be recognized. No one stood up right away, and that was the part the town would never understand later. Not the kneeling, not the silence, but the patience, the way every man there allowed the moment to breathe, as if rushing it would break something fragile and unseen, and Ethan remained where he was, hat in hand. The weight of it no longer just felt in his grip, but somewhere deeper, somewhere quieter, and she stepped forward again, this time fully onto the porch, no longer at the edge, no longer between, but beside him, not behind, not in front. And that single step shifted everything more than any word could have, because the line that had once separated them had disappeared without announcement, and the lead rider noticed it. Of course he did, his eyes tracing that distance that was no longer there. And something in his expression settled. Not surprise, not relief, but confirmation, and he rose slowly from one knee, not breaking the moment, but carrying it forward, and behind him the others followed, standing with the same measured calm, their presence now different, no longer waiting, but witnessing. And when he spoke again, his voice carried something new, something that belonged not just to him, but to all of them. Our people sent her to learn what cannot be taught by words. And the sentence moved through the air like a quiet current, and Ethan did not interrupt, did not question, because he understood that some explanations are not meant to be challenged, only received. And the rider continued, his gaze steady. Many saw her. Many turned away. Some offered things that looked like kindness, but were not. And his eyes flicked, just briefly, toward the distant direction of the town, as if the memory itself held weight. But you did not ask what she was worth. And those words landed differently, heavier, because they revealed something Ethan had not named for himself, something he had simply done without thinking. And beside him she stood with that same quiet stillness, her eyes forward, her presence no longer uncertain. And for the first time, Ethan allowed himself to look at her fully, not as someone he had taken in, but as someone who had chosen to stand where she was. And the realization settled slowly, like dust after a long ride, that this had never been about rescuing her, not truly. And outside, the riders shifted slightly, not restless, but aware, as if the moment was reaching its end, and the lead rider placed his hand lightly against his chest. A gesture that carried meaning without needing translation, and he spoke once more, softer now, but no less certain. What happens next is not ours to decide. And with that, the air changed again, not with tension, but with release, the kind that comes when something long held has finally been placed where it belongs, and Ethan drew a slow breath, feeling the weight of choice return to him. Not forced, not demanded, but offered, and the land stretched out before him, wide and quiet, holding more questions than answers, and beside him, she did not move, not speak. But in her stillness there was something unmistakable, something that said she would not be carried forward by another man's decision. And in that silence, under a sky that had watched countless choices made and unmade, Ethan understood that whatever came next would not be decided by wealth or land, or even the respect of the men standing before him, but by something far simpler and far harder. The kind of truth a man can only answer when no one tells him what the right answer is. The night did not end when the rider stood. It changed, like something unseen had finally taken its place among them. And the quiet that followed was no longer heavy, no longer waiting, but settled, certain, and Ethan lowered his gaze for a moment, not in doubt, but in thought, the kind that does not rush toward answers but lets them rise on their own. And when he lifted his head again, he did not look at the riders first. He looked at her, standing beside him with that same steady presence, not asking, not expecting, just there. And in that look something passed between them that no one else could fully read, not even the men who had traveled miles to witness it. And Ethan spoke then, not loudly, not with force, just enough for the night to carry his words where they needed to go. No one decides for her. And the sentence settled into the space like a line drawn not against others, but within himself. And the lead rider watched him closely, not reacting, not interrupting, simply listening in the way of someone who understood that what mattered was not the words alone, but the truth behind them. And for a long second, nothing moved, until she turned her head slightly toward Ethan, her eyes meeting his with a clarity that held no hesitation. And when she spoke, her voice was calm, steady as the land beneath their feet. "Then I will decide." And there was no defiance in it, no challenge, only certainty. The kind that does not need to be proven because it already is. And the riders remained still, not stepping forward, not stepping back, as if the moment had shifted entirely into her hands, and the wind moved again, softer now, carrying the faint scent of dry grass and distant water, and she took a step down from the porch, not away from Ethan, not toward the riders, but into the open space between them, where no one stood, where no one claimed ground, and she paused there, the silver bracelet catching the first hint of dawn that had begun to edge along the horizon. And for a moment she closed her eyes, not in uncertainty, but in recognition, as if listening to something deeper than the voices around her. And when she opened them again, she turned first to the riders, her gaze steady, acknowledging them without yielding to them. And then she turned back to Ethan, and in that single motion the choice became clear, not spoken, not explained, but seen, and the lead rider exhaled slowly, a sound almost lost in the quiet, and he gave a small nod, not of command, but of acceptance, as if something long awaited had finally reached its end. And behind him the others began to step back, not turning away, not breaking formation abruptly, but easing into distance with the same calm purpose they had arrived with. And no one spoke to stop them, because there was nothing left to argue, nothing left to prove, and as the first light of morning touched the land, the line of riders became shapes again, then shadows, then part of the horizon itself, leaving behind only the stillness of the ranch and the quiet truth of what had been chosen. And Ethan stood where he was, watching until the last movement faded, and when he finally looked back at her, there was no question in his eyes, no need for one, because whatever this was, whatever it would become, it had already begun the moment he chose to see her as more than what the world had decided she was. Morning did not arrive with noise. It came quietly, sliding over the land in soft light that revealed what the night had already decided, and the ranch stood just as it had before, wood and dust and silence. Yet nothing felt the same, not the air, not the ground, not the space between two people standing where a choice had been made without needing witnesses, and Ethan remained near the porch, his hat still in his hand, not because he had forgotten to put it back on, but because something in him had not yet returned to the way it was. And she stood a few feet away, not distant, not close, simply present in that same steady way that had followed her from the station to this place. And for a long moment neither of them spoke, because there was nothing left that required words, only understanding. And in the far distance the outline of the town began to wake, smoke rising thin and slow from chimneys. The kind of morning that would carry stories before. The sun reached its height, stories of riders, of silence, of men who had knelt where they had never bowed before. And those stories would grow, as stories always do, shaped by voices that had not been there. But out here, on this stretch of land that belonged to no one and everyone, the truth remained simple, unspoken, and complete, and Ethan finally set his hat back on his head, the motion small, familiar, grounding. And when he looked at her again, there was no question in his eyes, no need to ask what came next, because whatever it was, it would not be decided by him alone. And she met his gaze with that same calm certainty, the same quiet strength that had carried her through a place that had tried to erase her. And in her eyes there was no debt, no obligation, only choice. And she turned slightly toward the open land, the horizon stretching wide and unclaimed, and then back to him. And that single movement said everything that words would have only weakened. And Ethan gave a small nod, not as permission, not as agreement, but as acknowledgement of something shared, something chosen freely on both sides. And the wind moved again, lighter now, carrying no weight, no warning, just the simple sound of a day beginning. And somewhere behind them a fence creaked softly, a horse shifted, life continuing in the way it always had, yet marked by something that could not be seen but would not be forgotten. And as the sun rose higher, casting long lines of gold across the ground. They stood there for a moment longer, not rushing forward, not holding back, just standing in the space where the past had ended and something new had begun. And out here, where the land remembers more than people do, there is a quiet truth that settled in with the light, that respect is not given to wealth, and it is not taken by force. It is earned in the smallest moments, when no one is watching, when no one is counting, and when the world expects you to turn away, but you do not. And in that stillness, with nothing left to prove and nothing left to hide, the kind of justice that does not need words simply remained, steady as the horizon, and just as undeniable.